Welcome to another episode of Relay Theology. A few weeks back, I was delighted to have the opportunity to interview Dr. Quentin Smith. We sat down not far from the Western Michigan University campus where he was professor of philosophy from 1993 until he retired in 2015. Dr. Smith received his bachelor's degree in philosophy from Antioch College and his PhD in philosophy from Boston College. He has written and published over 140 articles and has written and co-written several books, including one with William Lane Craig titled Theism, Atheism, and Big Bang Cosmology. While brief, the interview covers a wide variety of subjects, from Smith's 1986 book on the felt meanings of the world to his contributions to the problem of evil, focusing on evil natural laws, as well as his thoughts on some contemporary theistic arguments. Here now is my interview with Dr. Quentin Smith. Quentin, thanks so much for agreeing to this interview. Typically, the first question I like to ask our guests is biographical in nature, and so I think I'll begin there. What is your background with regard to religious beliefs or irreligious beliefs?
Well, my parents were atheists, and they brought me up to be an atheist, and they brought my three brothers to be up an atheist, and they're just as confident in atheism as I am, but they don't think about it, and they're not philosophers. And I became a philosopher, so I began picking up arguments for atheism.
Because a lot of people, were brought up to be, either atheists or theists,
right.
And many of them don't particularly question those assumptions.
Right.
They stew in their respective context, right? What led you into thinking about these issues philosophically?
I think it was primarily my interest in philosophy, and then that was one of the areas in philosophy religion, so I became interested in that, and I think I first became a philosopher when I was 17. It was through reading Nietzsche's Will to Power, and his diagnosis of nihilism and the death of God and things like that. So that was my first encounter with issues about atheism.
And that was just that kind of sparked your interest there.
Yeah, not fit in with my thinking, and that influenced my thinking.
Sure.
And then I went on from there. I started off being a existentialist phenomenological philosopher. Okay. My first book was in that area. Felt Meanings of the World, and that defended an atheistic view of the meaning of the world. So the basic question in that book was, God is dead, as Nietzsche said, so does that mean that human life and the world are meaningless? And I argued no, that there are meanings, I called felt meanings of the world, which are appreciated in various emotional responses. And I described those, and they vary from meanings grasped in despair, which is meaninglessness, and joy, which is fulfillment. And I basically argued that there could be sufficient metaphysical meanings if atheism is true, as if theism is true.
Right.
And so that theism need not be the area of meaning in the area of metaphysics.
Right.
Where the world is meaningful only if God exists, and if God doesn't exist, then everything's meaningless.
Philosopher William Lane Craig is probably one of the best known defenders of an argument to that.
He and I co-authored a book together.
Yeah.
Theism, Atheism, Big Bang Cosmology.
Right. Yeah, I think his argument with regard to the meaning of life has to do with, at least as far as I remember, life is meaningful only to the degree that it plays some significant role in the kind of ultimate aim of the universe, essentially, that we play a part in God's plan.
Yeah, and I would argue that meaning need not be understood in terms of aims and purposes. It can be understood in terms of the ways in which the world as a whole is important.
Right.
And or is valuable. And I would say, for example, that in global joy, that motion we experience the world whole as fulfilled completely in as much as it just exists. Existence is a fulfillment. And so, even though it doesn't exist for a purpose, that's just mere existence is a fulfillment meaning.
Right.
And grasp and joy.
What's interesting here is that this notion that a life can, this theistic notion that a life can only be meaningful if we're created for some end.
Right.
I've wondered, it would seem at least that there's an implication here on God's life, wherein if God is uncreated and by definition, and therefore he cannot exist for any particular end, as we would exist for a particular end on theism. Would that spell despair for God, who did not choose his existence, right?
Right. It should consistently apply the categories of meaning that theists apply. Then you have to apply it to God and say, well, God wasn't created for a purpose, and there is no purpose except what for him are subjective purpose, he adopts himself.
Right.
So God, if he's allowed to have a meaningful existence by himself, then you have to allow that humans, if God doesn't exist, can have meaningful lives by themselves.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. So you've written on the problem of evil, specifically on something you call evil natural laws.
Right. Yeah.
So you call these evil natural laws. You're kind of talking about the law of predation, the fact that to survive, even as like a non-human animal, you have to pretty much eat another animal alive.
Right. Yeah.
Just the thorough violence in nature. That seems to be almost an essential component of just how nature has unfolded. And you argue that these facts can be used in an argument against theism. Could you kind of give a sketch of what that argument might look like?
Well, the idea that God is all powerful and all good, and he wouldn't have created a universe that contains animals that can only live by savagely attacking and devouring other animals, which is a horrible way to live. And doesn't seem plausible that all-powerful, all-wise, and all-good being would have created carnivorous animals who engage in predatory behavior, because that's not something intrinsically good, something intrinsically horrible.
Right.
I mean, having to kill other animals in order to live, and possibly kill oneself by other animals, and so that fact seems to be inconsistent with theism. That the law of the struggle for survival is not something that a God would create nature to be governed by.
Yeah, and so you suggest in this argument that there doesn't seem to be anything gained by creating the world in that way that wouldn't also be gained by just having the animals be vegetarians, essentially.
Right, yeah, right. It seems that if there really was a God, that he would have created all animals to be vegetarians, because then, you have the good of the animals existing, but that doesn't come at the price of the evil of other animals being savagely attacked, devoured, and eaten, and the suffering and death of that. You wouldn't have that, but you do have that. And that seems to be a strong component in the evidence that God doesn't exist.
Right, and it doesn't seem to be serving any real purpose, as you said.
No.
Now, so some of the kind of objections, to consider a few objections to this kind of line of argument, Christian philosopher Richard Swinburne would argue that natural evil, which your natural laws, your evil natural laws would be a part of, that natural evil is necessary in part for us moral agents to knowingly perform morally significant actions. And so from what I can tell, the thought here is that without knowledge of how our actions and how causal relations in the world can affect persons and non-human animals' lives for the good or for the better, without that kind of knowledge, then it doesn't seem like we would be able to do things that were intentionally good for other people, or do things that were intentionally bad for other agents or what have you. So this knowledge of the way the world works in this way, of all these different sufferings and these, the variety of sufferings and the variety of ecstasy that's felt, that kind of knowledge is necessary in order to move about the world in a morally significant way.
That doesn't seem to be plausible, though, because we take into account of what we do consider when we engage in morally relevant action. Mm-hmm. We don't think about animals. We just think about other humans. When we think about how to live a moral life, we think about how other humans have lived their lives. We don't think, well, animals have lived in such and such a way, and therefore we should live in such and such a way. That doesn't seem to be relevant. So it seems like you could have no carnivorous animals at all, have all animals be vegetarian, and that really would have no effect on how humans live their lives.
Right. And it would also seem that it does seem to rely on an assumption that the goodness of gaining that kind of knowledge and the goodness of being able to act in that way somehow overrides the profusion of suffering and of these evil natural laws. It's not at all obvious that this is a counterbalancing feature of the world. And there's also this notion that for this kind of objection to get off the ground, it seems to assume that the only way that we could gain knowledge of the relevant sort, even granting these assumptions that our knowledge for being moral agents is somehow tied to carnivorous animals, if we grant that, it seems to assume this objection, if it were to work, that the only way that we could become aware of these facts is to experience them as empirical findings in the world where these animals suffer, rather than as innate knowledge, for example, which would seem on theism to be rather plausible, that God could just create humans with this knowledge just right out of the box, essentially.
Right, yeah. You could create humans with an innate knowledge of what is good and what is evil, and a desire to do what's good. And then animal behavior is really ultimately irrelevant. Now, if you think about it, no one really considers animal behavior when they're considering their own moral behavior. And their own moral behavior is if anything's relevant to that, it's just behavior of other humans.
Some have recently argued this notion that kind of rejection of like neo-Cartesianism, where they say these animals, these non-human animals, while they are suffering in this life, perhaps there's an afterlife in which this suffering, these evils, they're defeated in some sense by perhaps being placed in a larger narrative that ultimately defeats these evils. What are some of your thoughts on that? Is that...
Well, it seems that that's stretching too far. I mean, it's pretty implausible. There's another life in which animals exist that makes up for whatever sufferings they have in their life on Earth.
Right.
It's not normally even thought that animals live after they die, have souls or anything. And that's not... It's been part of traditional philosophy that it's just humans that have an immortal soul. Animals don't. And so the idea that animals' suffering is made up by afterlife of animals has not really been a part of the philosophical mainstream. That seems intrinsically implausible in any way when you think about it.
So given that the fine-tuning argument, so we're changing subjects a little bit here, but the fine-tuning argument is kind of the modern face of the design argument, suggesting that there are these various cosmological parameters of which their life-permitting range is very narrow, and the actual world, we happen to fall within that very narrow range of the total possible range. And so that this, it is suggested, calls out for an explanation that is particularly well-fitting with theism and seems to be an awkward fit for a naturalist. I'm curious as to what your thoughts are on that kind of argument.
Well, it's hard to see what plausible point there is to the arguments. I mean, if there's fine-tuning, exactly what makes it fine-tuning? What is it fine-tuned for? And
Yeah, I think the notion here is that because life is a good thing, if we grant that assumption and we grant the assumption that God would want to bring about life, then we might say that God has kind of monkeyed with the laws of physics, right? In such a way as to enter into the initial conditions a kind of bias toward life, in such a way as to it being very finely tuned toward that end. So it's a kind of teleological explanation that brings about a universe that can give rise to life. And if you were to monkey with these levers, these initial conditions, or these various cosmological parameters, if you were to change them even so slightly, then life wouldn't be possible, is the claim. And so this is being forwarded as an argument for the existence of God.
Well, if you think that the universe is fine-tuned towards life, then that by itself doesn't seem sufficient to be counted as evidence for God's existence, because you have to consider, well, what sort of life are things fine-tuned for? Mm-hmm. If they are fine-tuned, and the imperfection of living creatures, the imperfection of the lives they live, makes it dubious if how much of a good that things have been fine-tuned for. And if things really were fine-tuned, they'd be fine-tuned towards lives that were happy and healthy and good, and rather than full of the sufferings and evil and problems that living beings are subject to. And humans are fine-tuned to engage in war, for example, or fine-tuned to suffer various diseases that cast doubt on whether we're really fine-tuned towards something good.
Right. So I guess what you seem to be saying is that even if it is the case that one could argue that the bare fact that life exists might favor theism, the kind of life that exists,
right?
The way in which life exists, the tendencies built within such life, and the context in which it exists, those factors are clearly pointing the other way, and so perhaps it doesn't seem like, when you take into consideration all of these facts, that it doesn't seem to favor one over the other.
Right, and also they're fine-tuned towards life. There's all sorts of higher forms of life that don't exist, but that could exist. Mm-hmm. And it seems there was fine-tuning, that'd be fine-tuning towards these higher forms of life.
Yeah.
Like towards beings that are, much more intelligent and psychologically mature and morally good than the humans.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Evan Fales makes this point where humans have these kinds of these dispositions toward groupishness and toward all these different tribal tendencies, right? And had we not had those, presumably the world would be a significantly better place. At least the moral evil would plausibly be significantly less. You've previously advocated an argument in kind of response to an argument from consciousness to God. You've argued that actually consciousness, or at least the fact that it seems to be physically dependent upon brains, that this fact is actually evidence against the existence of like an immaterial being. So it's evidence against God. Right. Could you talk a bit about that kind of argument?
Well, all that we know about consciousness is that it's dependent on brains. And so consciousness is essentially brain dependent. Mm-hmm. And the idea of a God is a consciousness that's not brain dependent, and that contravenes everything we know about consciousness.
Right. So this would be kind of an inductive explanation here.
Yeah, there's an inductive argument that from consciousness is that the conclusion would be that it probably is no brain-independent consciousness.
Right.
All consciousness is brain-dependent.
Mm-hmm.
And we have that from every example of a living being or an animal being that we know of.
So the argument wouldn't be that the fact that we observe all minds that we know of to be tied to brains, it wouldn't be that that disproves God. It's just that all those facts clearly constitute some significant evidence against such a being.
Yeah, I think
being
so.
detached from any kind of causal.
Right. Yeah, because they make it true that it's probable that all consciousness is tied to brains, and so the suggestion that there is consciousness that isn't is just not consistent with all the evidence that we have.
Thinking more about the notion of God as an immaterial mind, as God relates to time. There are different views on this, of course. Some argue that God, prior to creating a universe, exists in timelessness. It's just an atemporal existence, period. Others argue that God has his own kind of time extension from which he creates space-time, essentially. What are some of the kind of philosophical issues that kind of pop up in conversations about God and time that potentially pose some significant problems for theism?
Well, we can take time insofar as we know it is tied to the psychological and physical processes and to the events in time. And time untied to those things, we have no evidence that such a thing exists, and such a time would not be like the time that we know to exist. And so there would be no inductive evidence for like kind of either divine eternity or divine omnitemporality.
So I'm curious, with your interaction within philosophy of religion, what are some neglected issues, problems, or arguments that you personally would like to see given more attention among philosophers of religion?
Well, I think one you've already hinted at is that everything we know about consciousness and mentality is that it's brain dependent.
Right, like what does it mean for God to be a person if we can barely conceive of God as an immaterial mind?
Yeah, it seems to be we're using words beyond their normal senses. I mean, talk about God as being a person. I mean, it's all the ordinary criteria we use to recognize a person involve a mind or the person expressing itself and acting through a body.
What, in your opinion, would be the strongest theistic argument out there today that you think requires more attention or hasn't been adequately addressed? Do you think there is any with that kind of weight that impresses you, I guess?
No. I'm secretly unimpressed by theism. I'm just surprised that some people are theists. There just seems so few plausible arguments on behalf of it. And the basic view of theism, it just seems intrinsically implausible. It just makes it surprising why many people would believe that there is.
If you appreciate the content and the tone of what Real Atheology has to offer, please consider writing a review of the show on iTunes or contributing a modest amount per episode to the Real Atheology Patreon. The Real Atheology intro music is by Thomas Smith, with all other music by Jason Camo, The Lost State of Mind. We would like to thank our patrons: Matt Smith, Lucas Stewart, Matt Yellen, Richard Kane, John Danaher of the Philosophical Disquisitions blog, Kim Buzkowski, Andrew Snyder, Jason McOeta, Evan Wirtz, Bob April, and Alexander Songe.